Hi, this is Chris McKaylee, and today's video is to discuss some additional bill drafting guidelines that'll hopefully assist you in successfully drafting legislation here in California. The rules of punctuation. Punctuation is an important part of drafting any sort of legislation, and the punctuation rule should be used consistently and properly through your legislation. The bill drafter is going to know these rules as the courts will look at statutes with rules of punctuation in mind. So the drafter needs to follow these standard rules and even conform existing statutes if necessary. Internal references. When a bill drafter is amending or repealing code sections, the bill drafter needs to ensure that the proposed statutory changes are consistent with existing code sections. So if the proposed changes would create a conflict with an existing code section, then the drafter needs to amend or repeal the existing code section to make reference to and conform the existing code sections to any changes that you're making in the amended or repealed sections of the bill. In referring to other parts of a bill, the bill drafter should refer to the specific code section and avoid references such as herein, herein before, herein after, preceding, following, since these references can often create ambiguity. Definitions. As a general rule, a bill drafter should place a definition section that applies to an entire title, chapter, or article in a separate code section, generally at the beginning of that title, chapter, or article. And of course, place those definitions in alphabetical order. A clearly written bill needs very few definitions. And keep in mind that words used in their ordinary sense do not need definitions. In addition, keep in mind these rules. A definition that is restrictive usually follows the word means. On the other hand, a definition which is more extensive is usually followed by the word includes. On appropriations measures, in general, an appropriation of public monies should contain main provisions, including the amount of monies being appropriated, the sum of X, a source of the monies is appropriated from the general fund or a special fund, a fiscal year in fiscal year whatever, a recipient of those monies, such as a fund or a state agency, so to blank, and then the purpose of the monies for the purpose of explaining it. Synonyms. As a general rule, a bill drafter should avoid the use of synonyms. A change in wording may be construed to convey a change in meaning, which is likely to cause confusion for an agency that implements or interprets or enforces a statute, or a court when the court is trying to interpret the statutory language. Acronyms. As a general rule, a bill drafter generally avoids the use of acronyms, but an acronym may be used as an abbreviation of a scientific, medical, or technical term, or if it's otherwise commonly known, such as AIDS. Quotation marks. As a general rule, periods and commas do not appear inside quotation marks unless the punctuation is part of the quoted material. Do use quotation marks when defining a term and place those quotation marks over the word or phrase that is being defined. Parentheses. As a general rule, don't use parentheses to mark off explanatory or qualifying remarks. Instead, use commas and put them in a separate sentence. However, a bill drafter should use parentheses to set off the identifying numbers or letters of subsections or sub-clauses. Numbers. As a general rule, the bill drafter should write numbers as both words and numerals, and you enclose the numerals with parentheses. Commas. As a general rule, in a series separated by commas, always use a comma before the conjunction. Also, a subordinate clause at the beginning of a sentence is followed by a comma. and a subordinate clause in the middle of a sentence is set apart with commas. Possessives. In order to form the possessive of a common singular word ending in an S, add an apostrophe, an S, unless the next word begins with an S, in which case just add the apostrophe after the S. Creating state entities, a new one. When the legislature decides to establish a new agency, department, board, commission, or council, as you can probably imagine, there are quite a few issues that'll have to be addressed for the bill drafter to complete his or her task. A few of the key points that need to be considered when putting together a bill to create some sort of new state entity. What's the name of the entity? What is its general purpose? Is it independent or a line entity? How many board members? Include the number and the term in office. Specify the appointment and removal of these board members. Note whether they're paid or unpaid positions. Is there staff for this new entity? Do they have the power to adopt regulations? What are the specified duties of the new entity? Do they have hearings? Do they issue licenses or permits? Do they test licensees? How do they regulate those licensees? Do they have auditing and accounting functions? What about appeals from decisions of that state entity? How is the agency funded? Are there any fees associated with the entity or the licensees? Avoiding ambiguity. Often ambiguity is the result of an unclear sentence or unclear sentence structure, perhaps even the poor placement of words or phrases in the statute. In addition, the combination of nouns and their modifiers can often create trouble. So be careful to avoid ambiguity as much as possible. Clear, simple statutes are your goal. The length of sentences. Sentences in statutes sometimes are found to be long, and unfortunately often seem to grow longer. But sometimes the longer the sentence, the more likely it is that the statute's reader will have to ask questions about which words modify other words, which parts of the sentence go together. They might have to reread from the beginning. So to avoid confusion for those who are reading the statute, bill drafters should try to focus on drafting short sentences whenever possible. And if long sentences have to be used, then make sure that the structure is clear. Establishing any conditions. Often a statute sets forth a simple general proposition that is subject to certain conditions or exceptions. These conditions and exceptions are often added by amendment, and the more conditions and exceptions that end up applying, generally the longer and more complex the statute becomes. As a result, the bill drafter needs to organize a statute so that the general proposition remains clear while these conditions and exceptions are provided later. Now, generally, you want to use short, familiar words and phrases that best express the intended meaning of the statute, and try to avoid long words, especially when a short word will convey the exact same meaning. In addition, if it's possible to omit a word or phrase and still maintain the meaning of the statutory sentence, then the bill drafter should omit that word or phrase. Of course, be consistent in your word usage and structure your statute. And if at all possible, state a requirement directly rather than by use of certain exceptions.